Hey, in today's episode, we're going to talk a lot more about objects in GameMaker Studio 2. And we're going to also cover some basics of programming. We're going to hit on some variables, assignments, and if statements. So in the last episode, we talked a little bit about objects and instances, and that instances were copies of the objects inside the room. Now we're going to talk about how to use and program those objects so that you can use them in your game. So on the object, as I have here, this is the object editor, and I just opened the object from over here. Has some basic qualities to it. We covered a little bit of this. We have the name, and it's just a unique name to this object, so you can call it in programming later. It has a sprite associated to it, and there's two things here that are important. One is the sprite can be what the object looks like, so in this case, a red box. But it also acts as a secondary thing, which is a collision mask. As you see down here, it says collision mask. It says same as sprite. And that is it's using the image to detect when it hits something else. So it's using the borders of this sprite to see if it's actually hit anything else. And if it did, then it's going to say, hey, I collided with this and you could do something about it. The thing is, you can make your sprite one thing, and this is how it looks, and then you can choose a different image for the mask. And this can be really important if you want to have different types of collisions in your game. So I'm not going to cover too much of that, but the simple version of this is you can just choose a different image to represent that. And as we get to more complex scenarios where maybe you actually want lots of different masks to do different things, there is a programmatic way to do that. And I'm going to cover that when we get more into collisions themselves. All right, the next section, the only thing I'm going to cover in this is visible. Just note that if you uncheck this, the object, if it's in the room, will still be able to collide with stuff. It's just that you won't see it, but it's still using the same mask. So that's actually pretty important. Sometimes you want invisible barriers, or you just have an invisible object that's doing something in the background for you, and you just don't want anybody to see it. But in your editor, you want to see it. So unchecking that makes it invisible, but most of your stuff is going to be visible. All right, last thing. The only thing I'm going to cover today is events, and events are pretty important. So let's go ahead and jump into that. All right, I'm going to click on this, and it opens up a new window over here. And what we're going to have here is a bunch of events that we can assign to this object. Think of events as moments in time or moments that are happening constantly, sometimes once in the game. For example, the first time that the object gets created in a room, there's an event for that. It's called the create event. It gets run once and only once, never again. While the step event is something that runs all the time. It runs at every step of the game. And this is an important piece. There's a constant loop going on in the game. As soon as the game starts, it's looping over and over and over. And the number of times that it's looping per second is determined by how you set up your game options here. So if you click this little cog up at the top left hand, it says game options. I'm going to open that up. You see here it says game frames per second. I have it set to 60. I think the default when I set this up was 30. I'm using 60 here. So that means there's going to be 60 ticks or steps within the game per second. I'm going to go ahead and close this. We're going to go back up to here. So that means this step event right here, if I chose to create a step event, is going to happen 30 times a second. And this is a great place to put code where you're constantly checking to see what's going on. Did I hit something or testing stuff? That's a lot of what you're going to be doing in step events. Let's actually close this. What we're going to start with is a create event. Usually when you're setting up your object and you're going to set up things like your health or your damage or whatever information that you want to store about the player or the enemy or the weapon, this is where you're going to start setting it up. It's in the create event. Now let's go over a couple things in here so you're more familiar with what they are, especially if you're brand new to programming. So right here, what we get is 3 slashes and it says add description, insert description here. So what this is it's a comment, and this is just really, it's a descriptor that's telling us that we can name this. So I'm going to just call it create event. And as soon as I go away, you're going to see that this actually has changed over here. It says create event now. So this basically is the descriptive name that helps it when you're looking over here. What is this actually named? Because we could have this closed and you could have a bunch of stuff in here and you're wondering, what is that doing? So that's the next thing, I want to show you is this is a comment. A comment in programming is something that the program doesn't actually read, so it's really for you as the coder to put whatever you want in here. So you can put whatever descriptions you want in here to describe what your code's doing, and I encourage you to do so because it's very helpful later when you haven't seen your code in 6 months and you're trying to figure out what it did. The last thing I'll show you as far as a comment goes is you can put a slash and a star and then another slash and a star, and anything you write in between here is a comment and will not be read by the program. So it's another way if you have a lot of comment that you want to put in here, and instead of doing something like this, you could actually put comments in there like that. All right. Okay, let's get into our first programming. We're going to talk about variables. What are variables? Variables are things in your program that store information. So think of them as containers for numbers or text or anything like that. So for example, if we have hit points in our player, we can make a variable called HP, and we can put a number in there. Let's say our HP is 20, so we have 20 hit points. So this equal sign is an assignment operator which says put 20 into the name variable HP. We can then use this HP in later code instead of writing 20 all over the place. And it's a variable where you can change what's inside of it as well. So another one, let's say this player has a certain amount of damage. Let's say damage is equal to 2. So when we hit with our sword or our fist or bullets or whatever, this is how much damage the enemy would take and would subtract this much damage from their HP. These right here are called instance variables, and they're specific to the instance of this player object in this case, or an enemy object if you had an enemy object. And it would be specific to that inside the game. Meaning if you have 5 different enemies and they all had 20 HP and the player went and hit them, it hit one of them, it would deduct the 2 damage from only one of them, not all of them. And that's what we mean by an instance variable. So we've got this instance variable here. There are other kinds of variables, and this is actually super important. And I'm going to write speed here. You notice it turns green when I write that. That's because if I back up, it's going to give me this menu here that shows, hey, this is a built-in variable. And what all that means is there's a bunch of variables that already come for free in GameMaker. And you can just assign them, you can read them, you can play with them, but there's a lot of these that are already built in. And you can go check out all the built-in variables in the manual. Okay, so for now, we're going to stop with that. There are more variables to go over, but that's what we're going to focus on today. So let's use that speed one, and we're going to use another one to understand what those do. So we're going to use a built-in variable called direction. Direction is a built-in variable that sets points which direction the object is going to move once you give it speed. And it starts with 0, and it goes in a 360 degrees, so it goes to 359. So you can write anything from 0 to 359 to set the direction. 0 starts at the right, so it's facing right. So if I set the direction to 0, its movement would go to the right. The next thing you need to assign is speed. This tells it how fast it's going to move, how many pixels per frame, per step will this move. And so let's assign it to 2, and it will go pretty slow. All right, so the next thing we need to do, we've got all the code here. Now let's go put this in the room. Actually, I already did. I was setting this tutorial up. So now all we have to do is actually run this. Let's go ahead and run it. All right, so now it slowly moves across the room. Now let's say we didn't want it to move unless we were actually pressing a button. So how would we do that? Well, this is the creation event, and this actually only happens once. So if I put any more code in here for checking for whether or not somebody pressed the key, it wouldn't ever check this again because this only happens once. So what we're going to do is we're going to take this out of here. What we need to do is add code to the step event, since the step event actually gets checked every step, 60 times a second. So what we're going to do is check for keyboard. We're going to keep it simple today. We're going to learn about an if statement. An if statement is pretty simple. You just say if, and then within parentheses, you put logic in here that tells you whether or not it's true or false. If it's true, with whatever you put in here is true, let's say if 1 is equal to 1, that's true, then it will run whatever you want after that in these brackets. Okay, so you notice this. I put equals. What does that mean? Well, earlier when we were talking about variables and assigning values to them, we said HP equals 20. 1 equals is an assignment operator, meaning whatever's on the right side, push it into the variable on the left side. Equals is a comparing operator, which means check to see if these two are equal. You can also do something like the exclamation mark equals. That stands for not equal. You'll see a lot of this in code. You can do other things like greater than and equal to, greater than, or that's actually less than and equal to, greater than, and then greater than or equal to. So these are comparisons you can do. You can also call functions. So in our case, let's say we're going to call a function to check the keyboard. So GameMaker has a function that we can call. So we're going to say keyboard check pressed. So this, what happens is we're going to call this function and it's going to come back whether or not a certain key is pressed. And it's actually got some parentheses here. And what we do is we pass in a variable that says which key are we wanting to check for. So we're going to say VK, which stands for virtual key. You can press underscore and you can see all these constants that represent virtual keys. Virtual keys are just keys mapped on your keyboard. So in our case, we're going to say right. And all that's saying is the right arrow. There's a VK left, there's a VK up, and a VK down. So if I'm actually pressing the right button, we're going to set the direction equal to 0 and the speed equal to 2. Now when I do that, if I run this right now, and let's go ahead and do that, the box is not going to move when we first run the game until I press the right button. I press the right button now and I've let go and it's still moving. I'm pressing buttons and nothing's happening. Okay, so now what we want to do is check to see, well, what we're going to do is we're going to say if it's not, or basically we're just going to keep setting the speed to 0 at the beginning here. So speed is equal to 0 unless I actually press the right key, right? So let's do another if statement. And all we're going to do is I'm going to copy this with Control C and Control V. And I'm going to check for left here. So let's do left. And direction, instead of direction 0, we're going to do 180, which is the opposite direction. I'll set this to 2. So now I'm actually going to have checking right and left. But even if neither one of those are pressed, it's going to set the speed to 0. All right, pressing right. I'm actually having to keep tapping it and pressing left. All right, so the reason that wasn't working is because I'm using keyboard check pressed, and I should have known better. I just middle clicked. Let me show you that again. I middle clicked this word and it brings up the manual. This is an important tip you should know. The other way to do that is pressing F1. F1 will also bring that up. But anyway, so keyboard check pressed returns whether a given key the keyboard has been pressed. And then it says whether or not it's pressed. Unlike the keyboard check function, which only runs once every time the key is pressed down, this function only runs once for every time the key is pressed down. So what it means is that you have to keep pressing it for every single time to make it keep moving. So there's a check and a check pressed. I just selected the wrong one when I did that. So we're going to take out the pressed and run that again, and then it'll be a lot smoother. There we go. So left and right. So that's working just fine. All right, so today, that's what we're going to cover. I wanted to make sure I introduced you to some basic programming stuff and a little bit about events, just to get you guys started with this. The exercise for you guys today is to go check out the manual and see the different events. Open up yours and look at these different events and start to explore and start to think about what these things will do. There's a lot of different events in here. And we're going to cover a lot of these. We probably won't cover every single, we're like, if we do key up, we're not going to go check and test all these. I'm going to go over the basics of a couple of those and you're going to get the idea. All right. So I think next time we're going to start doing a little bit more with some loops. I'm going to teach you guys a bunch of different loops and probably do a little bit more conditional. I did a very simple conditional here. We'll start getting into or statements and statements, and then we'll cover looping, and there's a bunch of loops that we can go through. All right, so go check those out, start playing with events, and we'll start covering some more programming basics and more events in the next episode. Thanks for watching. I'll see you guys next time.